Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 34C, an interview on Ike and the Suez Crisis with Jim Newton. I'm excited to welcome Jim Newton to the show today. Jim is a veteran journalist, author, and lecturer in public policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. He is also the author of Eisenhower, the White House Years. And there are a lot of major events that happened during those years, but today we're going to focus on the one that might just have closed the book on Europe's era of global dominance, the Suez Crisis of 1956. Jim, thank you for your time.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So before we dive in, at a very high level, what was the Suez Crisis and why is it a big deal?
Well, big question and a good one to start with, I guess. Broadly speaking, I mean, General Nasser was in power in Egypt. He wanted to build the Aswan Dam, which he saw as a vehicle for improving agriculture in Egypt and modernizing the country. He was shopping around, shall we say, for support for that. In the way of that period, the non-aligned nations in that period often kind of played the United States and the Soviet Union against each other. And that's really what he was up to in the summer of 1956, trying to court American support for the dam, but also leave open the possibility of Soviet support either for the dam or for other projects.
And that was a big dam on the Nile River, correct?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, so the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. And so really at the highest level, the Suez Crisis is a geopolitical flashpoint or set up to be a geopolitical flashpoint between the United States and the Soviet Union, turned out not to be. So in that sense, it's different than all the others. But it was kind of built along those lines, even though it ultimately unfolded in a different way.
So it starts off with Nasser playing kind of the Soviets and the Americans against each other over support for a huge dam that's important to the development of Egypt.
Right.
But what ends up being the true trigger point is Egypt nationalizing the Suez Canal. And then England, France, and Israel all say, not so fast, my friend, and they retaliate. So How does this get from, before we touch on how we go from a dam to the canal, let's talk about what was the historic relationship between those three countries in Egypt. What's their involvement and interest? And let's start with England. When I think of England, I think of back in World War II, the Brits had a bunch of people in Egypt, and I know they were very invested in the canal. But what is their relationship with Egypt here?
Well, and interestingly, of course, Nasser, as an anti-colonial leader of Egypt, saw Britain as a foe, really, from his rise to power, and even dabbled with the idea of doing battle with the British during World War II in order to secure Egypt's independence.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of cross-cutting loyalties here, or cross-cutting history, I should say. Most relevant to this period, Britain and France were the primary builders of the Suez Canal and owners of it. So where there's a threat, now the canal was regarded properly as a sort of international resource. It was open to international commerce, but it passes through Egypt and it's owned by Britain and France. And so therein lies the rub of a struggle right there, that this monumentally important piece of infrastructure is located in one country and owned by two others with whom there are frosty relations.
Absolutely. And then what's Israel's involvement in this? I mean, Israel was just founded in 1948, about, 8 years before this whole crisis is going to happen, 8 years. So what's their relationship with Egypt like?
Israel founded in an unfriendly neighborhood, as people like to say, right? Yeah. So all of its neighbors were antagonistic toward Israel. Egypt is no exception. But Israel enjoyed the strong support of the West. Of course, the United States, Truman was instrumental in the foundation of Israel. But Israel, from the moment of its founding and really to the present, has always enjoyed the strong support of the United States. And with that, the support of the Western Alliance. So Israel had unfriendly immediate neighbors, but strong patrons, among them Britain, France, and the United States.
And when we say unfriendly, I mean, there had already been, what, one, two wars between Israel and Egypt at that point?
Yeah. Oh no, there have been conflict from the very beginning. The Six Day War. Israel saw Egypt as an existential threat. I mean, literally to its existence. And while the Suez Canal, of course, lies on the edge of the Sinai Peninsula.
Right, right,
The peninsula itself was something of a buffer between the two,
right.
but in effect, the countries, with the exception of that buffer, abut one another. So they are Egypt was a formidable enemy, very much on Israel's border.
Yeah, it didn't take 40 years to cross anymore, but it's still a big buffer right there, the Sinai Peninsula.
Right, right. I mean, a buffer, but right, a buffer. Right, as you say, it takes Moses a long time to cross this. It does not take tanks or planes as long to cross it.
Okay, so that's the state of play where Egypt, they have this canal owned by what they see as colonial foes. And they also have Israel, a very antagonistic relationship there. But what Egypt decides to do is they nationalize the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956. So to that earlier question, how did we get from a thing about a dam to nationalizing the Suez Canal?
Right. Well, short version of the long history there. As Nasser courted support for the Aswan Dam, Eisenhower set as a condition of that support that he ceased to seek support from the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. That antagonized Nasser, who, like many non-aligned countries in that period, felt both took advantage of the hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, and also often felt manipulated by it. And in this case, I mean, imagine this is the president of the United States telling his counterpart what he can and cannot do with respect to seeking foreign aid. Understandably irritates Nasser. So Nasser continued, despite Eisenhower's warning that he didn't want him courting Soviet support, continued to do so until finally Nasser sort of made up his mind and decided to accept an American offer of aid for the Aswan Dam. By that point, Ike and the U.S. Congress had grown so frustrated that he wouldn't abandon his solicitations to the Soviet Union that they withdrew that support.
Oh, wow.
So suddenly the support that he had assumed was kind of in his back pocket was withdrawn from Nasser, and now he's left without a patron for the dam. So he's not only angry, but really stands to have his dream pulled out from under him at that point.
Yeah. And so his response to that is to seize the dam. Why then? And also, what's it mean when we say nationalize the dam? What does that mean, nationalize the dam?
The canal.
The canal. I'm sorry, canal.
Yeah. No. They're easy. They're easy to mix up. They're all part of the same. They're even geographically sort of part of the same project. Well, what we mean by nationalizing is seizing on behalf of the government. Popular technique by smaller countries around the world, very much in this period. We had seen it, threats of it in different countries. Iran had talked about nationalizing its oil industry, and the Eisenhower administration's response was to wage a covert action against Iran and to topple Mossadegh. In Guatemala, the Arbenz regime had talked about nationalizing American companies there, and the Eisenhower administration overthrew Arbenz. So this was part of the geopolitics of this period, and this technique of nationalization was often a kind of flashpoint in these conflicts. So what it means is that Nasser, Egyptian troops, seized the canal, and he ordered the employees of the French and British to stay at work. So he wanted them to keep running the canal, but he was going to seize the revenue from it, and the Egyptian government would acquire ownership of the canal itself.
And so that revenue would help him build his dam, I presume.
Exactly. Right. So now he's got an alternative source for the money, and the removal of a thorn in his side, which is this giant foreign project running right through the middle of his country.
Okay, so how do England and France react to that? And how does Israel get impacted by this too? But let's start with England and France. I
guess the short answer is they react not well. This is deliberately provocative to them.
Yeah.
And while it may make a kind of logical sense from Nasser's perspective, it is clearly sticking his thumb in their eye. So their answer was to collaborate secretly, to contemplate a military response. And Eisenhower, recognizing that they would be inclined to do so, immediately tried to put the brakes on that and tried to say, this is not, let's not resort to violence or military action here. So his first steps in response to the seizure of the canal were to try to slow down what he expected the British, particularly the British response to be, which would be a military response. He thought that would not be constructive. And, Ike has some experience in military matters, obviously.
Yeah.
So his wisdom on that generally was accepted. And so in this case, I think he had initial reason to think that he could intervene to slow down this crisis and to prevent a military conflict.
So England and France, understandably, they're angry. This dam was worth a lot of money to them. It's vitally strategic important to them. England to reach India, huge. How does Israel get involved? How are they impacted by the seizure of the canal?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the best answer I can say to that is really indirectly. They have commercial interests. Of course, commerce flows through the canal. They're very close to the north end of the canal. And so they have a commercial and trade interest in the canal being open and accessible to them. Obviously, they would be frightened to have that commerce cut off by Egypt because Egypt is hostile to them. But I think the larger perspective for Israel is that this is an opportunity to ally militarily with Britain and France in pursuit of its other objectives, which is its own security in the region. And Egypt is such a threat to that security that now here's an opportunity perhaps to bolster that security with the assistance of Britain and France. Israel's interests in this are both very immediate and indirect, but also monumental in the sense that really at stake for Israel in almost any regional conflict in that period is its survival, because of a small country surrounded by enemies, and Egypt is chief among them, at least in that period.
All right, so we have Israel, England, and France coming together to hatch a plot. Eisenhower's trying to talk them out of it, not knowing what that plot is, but what is the plot they come up with? What is the plan that they land on for how they're going to respond?
Yeah, their plan hatched in secret. When I say secret, I mean deliberately kept from Eisenhower. Was to invade Egypt, re-seize control of the canal, and then demand that that all parties withdraw 10 miles. I think it's 10 miles or 10 kilometers, I forget, from the canal. So a sort of to create a kind of a protected zone. What would that mean? That would mean that they would reestablish their own control over the canal and presumably hope to avoid a wider conflict by freezing that situation in place. Now, that makes sense if you're Britain or France. It makes sense if you're Israel. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you're Nasser, because it undoes everything Nasser has just done. It does so in the name of a kind of restoration of stability, but it does so completely at the expense of Egypt. So it makes sense on the drawing boards. It doesn't make a lot of sense on the ground, at least if you're Egypt.
Cool. So that's the plan they have. And let's revisit why Eisenhower opposed this action. You'd laid out twice. Iran nationalizes oil. He gets involved. There's a coup. Yep. Guatemala talks about he gets involved. So why is he like, no, guys, don't worry about Egypt? Is it because it's not our canal? Like, why?
Yeah, also a good question. It's funny. I don't have a document to point to for this, but I remember as I went through the Eisenhower papers on this subject and on Middle Eastern relations generally, I pick up a kind of appreciation of Eisenhower for Nasser, and I don't know if that's a military bond or a kind of personal appreciation. I certainly wouldn't call it friendship, and I'm not even sure if I would call it admiration, but a kind of grudging respect for him. So I do think, oddly, I think there's a little bit of personal chemistry there, and that's never to be discounted entirely in international relations. I think another element here is that he was just frankly pissed off that France and Britain would do this without his consent and over his stated objections. He didn't. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is domestic issues. Eisenhower's facing re-election this summer. So the last thing he needs is a crisis in the Middle East. And I'm not saying that his re-election guided his response here. I actually think to some degree he even said he'd be willing to forego re-election to resolve this crisis. So who knows whether I take that with a grain of salt, but the point here is there's politics at all levels. There's there's geopolitics and there's also domestic politics for Ike. And all of them bend toward him not wanting a war in the Middle East in July of 1956. And that's really what this action threatened. I mean,
Yeah.
it's easy to think of Egypt as just vastly overmatched by Britain, France, and Israel, and to some degree that's true. But Egypt is no slouch. I mean, this is a
Oh, they got a big
significant
military.
country with a military
Yeah.
on its home turf.
Yeah.
This military action could easily have gotten out of hand, and that's in nobody's interest, least of all Ike's.
All right. So that's the plan. That's the thing of interest. And Ike doesn't want a war in July. He gets one in October instead, like a week before Election Day.
Yeah, can't win them all.
October 29th, 1956, 3 months, after or maybe a bit more than that, after the canal was nationalized, Israel invaded Egypt, if I got the details right, captured the canal, and then I think like France and England's navies were just there poised off the coast, ready to land. Oh, hey, we just happened to be in the neighborhood to keep the peace and be the heroes here. And as you said, restore their control of the canal. And I mean, I suppose almost kind of turn Egypt into a client state potentially at that level too. So when this happens, what is Ike's response when he hears what happened?
He is livid to discover that this has happened. And again, for all the reasons we've already kind of hinted at, right, that this is a conflict he does not want politically, a conflict that he's worried for the world's sake, what might happen. And he's directly told them, don't do it. And they can't win. Right? So he has spoken, he thinks, forcefully and clearly as the preeminent military political leader on earth at that point to close friends and allies, given them his strong recommendation, and they have not only disregarded it, but lied to him about it. And he was livid. Now, the other thing also to mention here, not to get completely sidetracked, but the Soviet Union is right in the middle of suppressing an uprising in Hungary as this is going on. So there's a real sense of the wheels coming off the bus in this moment in terms of the balance of powers and containment strategy, and Eisenhower as the skillful hidden hand leader of this Cold War conflict. All of that is fraying at the moment as this is happening. So Ike is additionally stressed by that. Now that's not the fault of Britain, France, or Israel. That's a separate conflict, really. But from Eisenhower's perspective, this all has to be managed at once. Eisenhower, from the day he took office to the day he left, governed with the very real threat of a nuclear war, of a global confrontation. And at this moment, with Hungary at war, with Egypt at war, with three stalwart American allies, the possibility of either of those conflicts escalating into nuclear war was real, much less two at once.
So you brought up the Soviets. This crisis is happening, and the Soviets also oppose the intervention. What was their reasoning, and how weird was it to see the Americans and the Soviets on the same side of an issue at this time?
Yeah, there's a UN vote in the middle of this where I think there's 5 or 6 no votes. And the no votes are Israel, France, Britain, a couple others, I guess. And the yes votes include both the Soviet Union and the United States. It's really almost unheard of in the period. I mean, in a funny way, the Soviet response is truer to form. I mean, you expect in a conflict that involves Britain and France on one side and a third world nation or second world nation, whatever we're going to call it, Egypt, up and coming economy like that, you almost normally expect the Soviet Union to be on that side of that conflict. The more unusual thing is to find them in an alliance with the United States on that side.
Right.
So it's really the Eisenhower response that's historically more anomalous. But yes, the result, and to find the Soviet Union and the United States on the same side of the Egypt conflict and on diametrically opposite sides of the Hungary conflict at the same in the same summer. So it's a very bewildering international situation for sure.
Okay, so Ike, saying don't do this or get out is one thing, but Israel's already captured the canal. Those navies of England and France are right there. So how does Ike actually get them to listen to him? How does he force them to comply and abandon what
Yeah.
they're doing?
And this part in some ways is the most fascinating of all because of course, he's never going to go to war against
Right,
Britain and France. I mean, that's
right,
I
right.
can't imagine that was ever even discussed. But he does punish them for it. He imposes sanctions. He restricts oil that's passing from various countries to Britain and France, particularly Britain. He publicly castigates Eden in Britain. I know Eden very shortly
Is that the
thereafter.
PM?
The prime minister. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Very. This cost him his office and really his well-being. It was really hard on him physically, even to weather this crisis. I wasted no effort to punish these countries for it and to punish them into submission effectively. So it's not, and he went to the UN, and the UN took action against them. So, which he joined, as I say, in the strange combination with the Soviet Union. So he didn't just stop at privately upbraiding them for this. He took forceful economic action and public economic action against them. And so that's, I guess I'm searching my memory. I can't think of another instance, certainly in the Eisenhower years, but I can't think of another instance even beyond that where America acted so publicly and forcefully against Britain and France.
For sure. And did it work right away? I mean, we had these navies like England and France. Did they ever get involved in Egypt, or was this enough that their navies turned home?
Yeah,
And
it did not immediately yield the result that I hoped. They did not immediately withdraw. But over time, and I'm struggling now to recall the amount of time, but
yeah,
there over the coming weeks, months, that's what you should check me on. But ultimately, yes, the Suez Canal for a time reverted to British management, British and French management, but then over time,
yeah,
ultimately passed over to
back
Egypt
to Egypt.
as Nasser had hoped. Israel did withdraw. I mean, Israel's hope and all of one hope of many, I'm sure, was that if they could agree on this 10-mile zone, that would leave Israeli forces on the peninsula and
Right.
create a much deeper buffer between Israel proper and Egypt proper, using the Sinai as more of a buffer. Ultimately, that zone evaporated and Israel returned to its borders. So it didn't secure the long-term advantage that it wanted. But the Sinai remained, and really in some ways even today remains, a sort of largely uninhabited area that provides some protection from both of them. So the short-term response to Eisenhower's, none of these countries yielded immediately,
Mhm.
but they did yield. And I think it really, I used the term earlier, Fred Greenstein coined the expression the hidden hand presidency. Often it's hard to tell the precise results of an Eisenhower foreign policy initiative because they were often conducted quite quietly, and only it's hard to it's hard to tell. It's only possible to tell by looking at the papers what results they had sought and what results they achieved. This is a bit of an exception to that because this took place in the most public possible way, and though it took some time, it ultimately achieved the Eisenhower objectives, which is to restore to restore Egypt to its borders, to bring Britain and France out of the region, or at least out of the region militarily, and to ultimately pass control over the canal to Nasser in Egypt.
So if you were to look at like what did each country win or lose in this, starting with England, France, Israel, Egypt, what would that ledger look like?
Biggest loss, I would say, would go to Britain in the sense that it was Eden, the prime minister, who
Yeah.
Eisenhower was most furious about. There's a scene where I think it was Dulles or American diplomats confronted the British ambassador in Washington, and they were just stunned by how vehement the meeting was. It's really the rare series of meetings between Britain and the United States during this period where they're just openly at odds.
Mhm.
For the most part, that was a very secure relationship and remains so today. But so I would count Britain and the Prime Minister Eden as the biggest losers of the conflict. France, maybe more of a misdemeanor loss than a felony, but because they had less at stake,
Yeah.
but ultimately did not prevail. So in that sense, a loss. And same with Israel. I think Israel saw this as an opportunity to advance its interests and ultimately didn't succeed in doing so. But in no real way did it actually strip it of anything. It just returned to the sort of status quo
Right.
before the war. Biggest winners, well, obviously Egypt and the Nasser government. They got the canal they wanted and ultimately built the Aswan Dam. And so this, although a bumpy way to get there, ultimately got them where they wanted. And I would count Eisenhower and the United States as a winner in this. I mean, I think it was powerful to the third world to see the United States rise up in defense of Egypt against its own historic allies. It helped. It certainly didn't erase, but I think it helped mitigate the general feeling that the United States fought on behalf of Western democracies and against emergent democracies. It scrambled that traditional sense that the Soviets were the allies of those countries and the United States was a privileged country away from that. In these days, it was the Eisenhower, the administration's role in the Arbenz and Mossadegh actions
Right.
were not widely known.
Right.
But
Right.
as those became known,
Yeah.
that solidified a sense of the United States as a sort of oppressive northern neighbor. This is a good counterexample to that narrative. So I think in all those ways, the timing is a little scrambled because it didn't answer the questions about Arbenz, for instance, because people just didn't know. But
Right.
as those facts became known, this was a good counterfactual argument. I mean, it was an argument on the other side of that equation. So in that sense, I think, and of course, Eisenhower succeeded in suppressing this from becoming the regional or even a global conflict. So in all those ways, I would count Eisenhower and therefore the United States as a winner in this as well.
And I'm curious what you would make of the statement I made at the top of the show, that this was a moment that might have kind of ended that era of European global dominance. Was this a milestone in that, or more of a speed? What would you make of that,
Yeah.
of how the world perceived? Who's really running this globe?
Uh-huh. It's funny. I'd never heard it characterized that way until you just did. So I've been thinking about it as we've been talking. I think there's a case to be made for that. I mean, as I say, I haven't ever heard that characterization of it, but it's certainly, at a minimum, it is a moment where the expectation that Europe and the United States would act in concert to get their way in other parts of the world fractured. We've seen some of that since in Syria, is coming to mind, and in many other instances. So, is it the end of one era and the beginning of another? I'd have to think more on that. I think, but it
Yeah.
certainly is an inflection point in a relationship, and it has been more complicated since, and for the better, by the way, since. So, in that sense, yeah, I think you could make a good case for that statement. Yeah.
And the last question I got for you is, what lessons in leadership can we learn from how Eisenhower navigated this crisis?
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about that in anticipation of our talk today. It's funny because most of the lessons that I would say that Eisenhower bestowed on us are not really in evidence in this crisis, in the sense that he was very reluctant to use military force. That's true here, too. Of course, the United States didn't engage militarily. Very reluctant to use military force, very willing to threaten. Generally, very conscientious about the maintenance of alliances. This is, after all, this was the first head of NATO. His title was
Yeah.
Supreme Commander, which is a
Yeah.
big one to wear on your shoulder. And so his instinct was almost always to work in close concert with America's European allies, almost always in opposition to the Soviet Union or to some degree China, and to do so quietly. And that the great statistic that I like to say, that I like to cite to people about the Eisenhower administration is that through 8 years of enormous prosperity and growth, the total and an ongoing nuclear fueled conflict with the Soviet Union and China, the total number of American battle casualties from the end of the Korean War. The Korean War came to an armistice 6 months after Eisenhower took office. The total number of American battle casualties from that point to the end of the Eisenhower administration is 1. There's 1 American serviceman shot to death in Lebanon. That's the only battlefield casualty of the post-Korea Eisenhower administration. So,
wow.
And there's really nothing like that in American history, a period like that. Certainly a period of, when you think about all of the global conflicts that occurred during those 7.5 years. This one's a little different because this is much more publicly waged. It's not in concert with our allies. In fact, that's what makes it so special, is that it was in opposition to the allies. So in that sense, it's atypical, I think, of Ike's diplomacy. But it does have some of those hallmarks, that willingness to threaten, that use of economic power, that genuine reluctance, really deep-seated reluctance to commit American forces to battle, but the willingness to let the other side think you might do so at any given moment. All of that's here. And those, I think, are really important lessons of the Eisenhower years. And, Eisenhower's the first American president to have a nuclear weapon and not use it, right? I mean, Truman's the first to get it and used it. Yeah. And then Ike got it, and for years Ike had it and could have used it. Many people wanted him to use nuclear weapons to end the Korean War.
Right.
So that power, that maintenance of power without the full use of it, is a lesson of humility and strength in humility, I think, that Lord knows we would be well to observe today. And I think that many presidents aspire to it. Few have mastered it as well as he did.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Jim and want to learn more about Eisenhower, please pick up Eisenhower, The White House Years from your nearest bookstore. Jim is also the editor of Blueprint Magazine at UCLA, a public policy magazine you may well enjoy. Thank you for your time, Jim.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you to everyone who has contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we're going to take a closer look at the election that put Ike in the White House. 1952 was a fork-in-the-road year for the Republican Party and the nation. Isolationism and internationalism were on the ballot. And in one of the crazier counterfactuals I've seen, we were this close to having President Douglas MacArthur in the White House. A discussion with our old friend Christopher Nichols of Ohio State on the election of '52 is coming up next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.